The call came in at 4:47 a.m. Within 90 seconds, Special Agent Miranda Reyes knew that everything her team had worked toward for 11 months was about to either collapse or explode into something far larger than anyone had anticipated. The voice on the other end belonged to a confidential informant who had been feeding Homeland Security investigations intelligence on a network of shell companies operating out of central Ohio. For nearly a year, this source had provided fragment shipping manifests that didn't add up, warehouses that received deliveries but never seemed to ship anything out, cash-heavy businesses that somehow survived despite having almost no visible customers. But tonight, the informant's voice carried something different. Terror. "They're moving the kids tonight," he whispered. "All of them. Something spooked them. You have maybe 6 hours before they disappear." Reyes didn't waste time asking questions. She was already reaching for her secure phone, initiating a cascade of calls that would, within the next 5 hours, mobilize over 300 federal agents from FBI, HSI, and local law enforcement across 4 states. What none of them fully understood yet was that they were about to crack open one of the largest human trafficking operations ever discovered on American soil. A network so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in legitimate business infrastructure that its architects had operated in plain sight for nearly a decade. The story of how federal agents stormed an Ohio hub and rescued 290 children while exposing a billion-dollar trafficking empire doesn't begin with that pre-dawn phone call. It begins years earlier, in the overlooked corners of American commerce where exploitation hides behind spreadsheets and corporate registrations. Picture the landscape of central Ohio, a region defined by interstate highways that crisscross like arteries pumping commerce through the heartland. Columbus sits at the intersection of major trucking routes, a logistics hub where goods from across the nation pass through distribution centers the size of small towns. It's precisely this infrastructure, this constant flow of anonymous commerce, that made the region attractive to a criminal enterprise that had learned the most dangerous lesson in organized crime. The best place to hide is in plain sight. The man who built this empire went by several names across different documents, but federal investigators came to know him as Marcus Eldon Webb. On paper, Webb was a success story, a self-made logistics entrepreneur who had built a network of warehousing and transportation companies across the Midwest. He served on the boards of local charities. He donated to community organizations. He attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new business development. And beneath this carefully constructed facade, he operated a human trafficking network that had, over 9 years, moved thousands of victims through a system so bureaucratically complex that it had evaded detection by hiding in the spaces between jurisdictions, between agencies, between the cracks of a system never designed to catch predators who thought like accountants. The investigation that would eventually bring down Webb's empire began not with a dramatic tip or a rescued victim, but with an accounting anomaly. An IRS analyst named Patricia Huang was reviewing corporate tax filings when she noticed something peculiar about a cluster of Ohio-based LLCs. These companies, 12 of them, all registered within an 18-month period, showed remarkable similarities in their financial structures. Each reported just enough revenue to appear legitimate, but their expense categories contained identical percentage breakdowns that defied statistical probability. It was as if someone had created a template and simply changed the names. Huang flagged the irregularity, and her report eventually made its way to a multi-agency task force that had been tracking suspicious financial patterns linked to organized crime. The task force included representatives from HSI, the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division, and the Department of Justice's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit. When they began pulling threads on Webb's corporate network, they discovered a web of over 60 interconnected businesses spanning transportation, warehousing, hospitality, and, most disturbingly, youth services. Here is where the investigation took its darkest turn. Among Webb's holdings were 3 organizations that presented themselves as charitable services for at-risk youth, residential programs that claimed to provide housing and support for teenagers aging out of foster care, runaway intervention services, and job training programs for young adults. These organizations received grants, they passed inspections, they had glossy websites and testimonials from community leaders, and they were, investigators would later determine, our intake points for a trafficking operation that sorted vulnerable young people into different streams of exploitation. The victims came from across the country, drawn by promises of stability that never materialized. Some were recruited from homeless encampments. Others were identified through social media, targeted by traffickers who had developed sophisticated methods for identifying vulnerable individuals, kids with unstable family situations, histories of abuse, or simply the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might offer them a way out. What they found instead was a system designed to strip away their identities and transform them into commodities. Federal agents working the investigation interviewed dozens of survivors in the months leading up to the raid, and the pattern they described was chillingly systematic. New arrivals were separated from any identification document. They were moved frequently between locations, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections or attract attention. They were given new names, new backstories, new explanations for why they couldn't contact family or friends. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the financial structures that funded the operation. Special Agent Reyes had worked human trafficking cases for 12 years, but what she encountered in the Ohio investigation was unlike anything in her experience. Most trafficking operations she dismantled were relatively simple, predators exploiting a handful of victims through direct coercion. Webb's network operated more like a corporation, with departments and divisions, with middle managers who handled logistics while remaining deliberately ignorant of what they were facilitating, with accountants who laundered proceeds through legitimate business operations without ever directly witnessing the crimes their work enabled. The decision to move on the network came after months of surveillance and intelligence gathering. Agents had identified what they believed were the primary holding locations, warehouses and residential properties scattered across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, where victims were kept before being moved to their ultimate destinations. But the informant's call changed everything. Whatever had spooked Webb's operation meant they were accelerating their timeline. The careful, methodical takedown Reyes had planned would have to become something far more chaotic. In the 5 hours between that phone call and the synchronized raids that would unfold across 17 locations, federal agents coordinated an operation of extraordinary complexity. FBI SWAT teams staged near primary target. HSI agents prepared to secure evidence at corporate offices. Local law enforcement established perimeters to prevent fleeing suspects from escaping into surrounding neighborhoods. Child welfare specialists stood ready to receive victims who had, in many cases, spent months or years in captivity. The primary target was a sprawling warehouse complex on the outskirts of Columbus, a facility that officially belonged to one of Webb's logistics companies. Satellite surveillance had tracked unusual activity there over the preceding weeks. Vehicles arriving late at night, patterns of movement that suggested something beyond ordinary warehousing operations. What agents couldn't know until they breached the facility was that this warehouse had been converted into something far more sinister, a sorting and holding facility where victims were processed, documented, and prepared for transfer to buyers across the country. At 9:52 a.m., the raids began simultaneously. Federal agents breached doors in Columbus, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Louisville. They moved through office buildings, seizing computers and financial records. They swept residential properties where Webb's lieutenants lived. And at the Columbus warehouse, SWAT teams encountered something that would haunt every officer present for the rest of their careers. The facility had been divided into sections using temporary walls and shipping containers. In these improvised holding areas, agents found 290 children and young adults ranging in age from 11 to 23. Some had been held for weeks, others had been there for months. Many were so conditioned to compliance that they initially resisted rescue, having been told that law enforcement would harm them, that their families had abandoned them, that the traffickers were the only people who could protect them from a world that didn't want them. The scene that unfolded in the hours after the raids defied easy description. Child welfare specialists worked to identify victims who had, in many cases, been stripped of any documentation that could confirm their identity. Medical personnel evaluated individuals suffering from malnutrition, untreated injuries, and the psychological trauma of prolonged captivity. Translators were brought in for victims who had been trafficked from other countries. The investigation would eventually reveal that Webb's network had international connections, bringing victims from Central America and Eastern Europe through channels that exploited gaps in immigration enforcement. As agents processed the warehouse scene, a parallel operation unfolded at Webb's corporate headquarters. The financial records recovered there would take forensic accountants months to fully analyze, but preliminary examination revealed the scope of the operation's profitability. Webb's network had generated an estimated $1.1 billion over its 9 years of operation, with proceeds laundered through his legitimate businesses before being funneled into offshore accounts and real estate investments. And the trafficking operation had been profitable enough to subsidize Webb's legitimate companies during periods when they might otherwise have struggled. A perverse business model where human exploitation funded the appearance of respectability. Webb himself was arrested at his residence in an affluent Columbus suburb. Agents reported that he seemed almost resigned when they arrived, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. Among the evidence recovered from his home were meticulous records documenting the operation's structure, organizational charts, operational protocols, even performance metrics tracking the efficiency of different trafficking routes. Webb had run his criminal empire with the same attention to detail he brought to his legitimate businesses, and this documentation would prove essential in prosecuting not just him, but the network of facilitators who had enabled his operation. The investigation that followed the raids would expand in directions no one initially anticipated. Among Webb's records were communications with buyers, individuals and organizations who had purchased access to trafficking victims for various purposes. Some of these buyers operated escort services in major cities. Others ran labor exploitation schemes on agricultural operations. A disturbing subset operated what investigators described as closed community, isolated compounds where purchased victims lived entirely outside the view of mainstream society. Perhaps most troubling were the connections investigators found between Webb's network and individuals in positions of public trust. Not everyone who facilitated the operation was a criminal in the traditional sense. Some were bureaucrats who had been bribed to overlook irregularities in paperwork. Others were business owners who had leased property to shell companies without asking questions. A few were local officials who had expedited permits and approvals for Webb's organizations in exchange for campaign contributions and personal favors. The corruption wasn't dramatic. There were no midnight meetings or briefcases full of cash. It was mundane, administrative, the kind of complicity that thrives when people convince themselves that not knowing makes them innocent. The aftermath of the Ohio raids reverberated through federal law enforcement for months. The 290 victims recovered represented the largest single rescue in HS1 history. But agents understood that these individuals were only a fraction of those who had passed through Webb's system over nearly a decade. The investigation sparked a systematic review of how trafficking networks exploit legitimate business infrastructure, how they build resilience through corporate complexity, how they hide in the spaces between agencies whose jurisdictions don't quite overlap. For Special Agent Reyes, the case became a template for understanding a new generation of trafficking operations, organizations that had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, that operated with the sophistication of multinational corporations, that understood that the best camouflage in modern America isn't secrecy, but the appearance of boring legitimacy. The lessons from Ohio would influence how federal agencies approach trafficking investigations for years to come, driving reforms in interagency coordination and financial intelligence sharing. What haunts investigators most, though, isn't the operational details or the financial complexity. It's the knowledge of what they didn't find. Among Webb's records were references to victims who had passed through his system years earlier, individuals who were sold, transferred, or simply disappeared from documentation without explanation. For every child rescued in those raids, there are others whose fates remain unknown, whose names may never be recovered, whose stories ended in ways that investigators can only imagine and dread. The children and young adults rescued from the Columbus warehouse faced long roads to recovery, but many had no families to return to. The vulnerability that made them targets in the first place often meant they had been failed by every system designed to protect them long before they encountered Webb's recruiters. Federal victim services work to place survivors in appropriate care, but the psychological damage inflicted by months or years of captivity doesn't heal on any predictable timeline. Some survivors would eventually testify against their traffickers, finding a measure of justice in seeing their abusers held accountable. Others would struggle for years with trauma that defies easy resolution. Marcus Webb currently awaits trial on charges including racketeering, conspiracy to engage in sex trafficking of minors, forced labor trafficking, money laundering, and dozens of additional counts that could result in multiple life sentences. His attorneys have attempted to portray him as a businessman who lost control of organizations that operated without his knowledge, a defense that prosecutors dismiss as laughable given the documentation recovered from his personal residence. The trial, whenever it occurs, will likely take months and will expose details that investigators have only hinted at in public statements. But trials and sentences, however lengthy, cannot undo what was done to 290 children and the thousands of others who passed through Webb's system before federal agents finally closed in. They cannot restore years stolen from young people who deserved protection and instead found exploitation. No, they cannot answer the questions that keep investigators awake at night. How did this operate for so long? How many people looked the other way? How many others are operating similar networks right now, hiding behind the same corporate camouflage that protected Webb for nearly a decade? These are the questions that matter far beyond this single investigation. Human trafficking doesn't happen only in shadows and abandoned buildings. It happens in corporate offices and residential neighborhoods. It happens in cities with active law enforcement and functioning social services. It happens because sophisticated predators understand that the most dangerous place to hide isn't the darkness. It's the blinding light of ordinary commerce, where horrors can proceed unnoticed because no one thinks to look. Well, the Ohio investigation revealed a network built on this understanding, and dismantling it required federal agents to think differently about what trafficking looks like in 21st century America. The warehouses and shell companies and nonprofit fronts were just infrastructure. The real architecture of Webb's empire was the assumption that some crimes are too complex to be caught, that bureaucratic camouflage provides permanent protection, that victims without voices will never be heard. What happened in Ohio proved that assumption wrong. But it should never have taken 11 months of investigation and a panicked pre-dawn phone call to find 290 children held in a warehouse in the American heartland. The systems that are supposed to protect vulnerable young people failed catastrophically, repeatedly, over nearly a decade. And until those systems are rebuilt to catch predators like Webb before they can build empires, the question isn't whether there are more networks operating in plain sight. The question is only how many and how long before someone looks closely enough to see them. If this investigation matters to you, share it. Talk about it. Because the only thing that protects operations like Webb's is the silence of people who assume someone else is paying attention. In the end, what brought down a billion-dollar trafficking empire wasn't just federal agents and forensic accountants. It was one informant who decided they couldn't stay silent anymore, one IRS analyst who trusted her instincts about suspicious filings, one task force that connected dots that others had dismissed as coincidence. But ordinary people who chose to look when looking was uncomfortable. That's how these networks are found. That's how these children are saved. That's how this story, fictional though it is, points towards something terribly real about what happens when we assume that evil always announces itself, that criminals always look like criminals, that children in danger will somehow be visible to systems designed to protect them. Sometimes they're hidden in warehouses, sometimes they're hidden in plain sight, and sometimes the only difference between rescue and oblivion is whether someone decides to pay attention.